Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Heritage Wilmot this evening as we celebrate Wilmot's annual Heritage Day. My name is Nick Bogart, and I'm the chairperson of the Heritage Wilmot Advisory Committee. You may have also seen other members of Heritage Wilmot and Township staff here, as well as members of council. It's been a few years since we've been able to have an in-person event, so we're pleased to welcome everyone here, and it's a great turnout tonight. We're happy to have you here celebrating our shared heritage. We like doing events such as this. It's something that we're proud to do each year, so I'm glad we can get back to in-person events. Before we get started, I'd like to begin with a territorial acknowledgement and introduction from Councillor Stephen Martin.
Thank you, Nick. We've gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community. I also want to welcome all of you here to this annual Heritage Day event. The Heritage Wilmot Committee has been hosting Heritage Day events in Wilmot for more than 30 years. And I'd like to congratulate you as a committee for having the longest running event in Waterloo Region. So that's quite an accomplishment. We're excited to be gathering in person for this event once again. As we come together today, we're reminded of the tremendous impact of our country's cultural heritage and reflect upon Canada's Indigenous heritage and culture. Today is a day to celebrate and to learn more about the many traditions, cultures, languages, values, and beliefs that have come together to shape our unique community. It's also a day to appreciate diversity and recognize the contributions of all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds or origins. At a time when the world appears increasingly divided, it's important to recognize the power of unity and embrace our collective heritage. When we gather together, learn together, and work together, we can continue to create an inclusive and welcoming community.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Now, I would like to introduce our speakers this evening. We have Gary Warrick, Professor Emeritus, Department of Archaeology and Heritage Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and Tanya Hill-Montour, Archaeology Supervisor of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Thank you both for coming, and with that, I'll turn the floor to you.
Sego Guego, Councillor Martin, that was awesome. Appreciate that. That was a really good land acknowledgement. Actually, it's probably one of the best I've heard. Wilmot, I'll say, and Baden, this whole area for me is very special. So thank you for inviting me today. So I'm Tanya Hill-Montour. I'm the Archaeology Supervisor for Six Nations of the Grand River. It's important for me today to start because before anything special for Indigenous people, we like to open in a good way. So I'm going to open in my Ganikahaga, so this is my Mohawk language. Dayale Tiado, Nangwe Soha, Eto Nohage, Nenagwat Nagola. And basically what I said was that we all come together with a good mind. So Ongwe Soha means all the people. So Indigenous language is really, it's complex. One word, Ongwe Soha, means a whole sentence, right? So we also have the Ganokweho, which is our Thanksgiving address, and we generally say this before in our opening before we do anything that is really special to us. So basically the Thanksgiving address is words that come before all else. So Indigenous people are very connected to the land through our ceremonies, through our songs, through our dance. So I just want to provide the words what the Thanksgiving address means in English. So this was translated a few years back, which if I was to say it in my Mohawk language, it would take me a bit. So right now, and you would not be able to understand it because it's in my native tongue. So words that come before all else. People, let it be this way in our minds, earth. Let it be this way in our minds, medicine. Let it be this way in our minds, fruits and berries. Let it be this way in our minds, trees, shrubs, bushes. Let it be this way in our minds as animals. Let it be this way in our mind, water. Let it be this way in our mind as substance. Let it be in this way of our minds, air. Let it be in this way in our minds, thunders. Let it be in this way in our minds, the sun. Let it be this way in our minds, the moon. Let it be this way in our minds, the stars. Let it be this way in our minds, Handsome Lake. Let it be this way in our minds, the four sacred beings. Let it be in this way in our mind as the Creator. Let it be in this way in our minds. So this is important for us. This is what the Thanksgiving address outlines. It's just giving thanks to all the connection that we have to the land. And sometimes that part gets forgotten. And it's really important for Indigenous people to make sure that we respect Mother Earth. So thank you, Nyawagoa. I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Okay, Nyawa, Tanya, for that, and thank you for the land acknowledgement too. It is a good one. I don't know who wrote the one for town of Wilmot, but it's better than a lot of university land acknowledgements, let me tell you. So, I'm an archaeologist. I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario. Got my training at McMaster, Simon Fraser University, and then McGill University. Then I ended up back in Ontario, working for the Ministry of Transportation for 10 years. I never thought I'd work that long in helping to pave Ontario black, I called it, right? Because as an archaeologist, we went out in advance of highway widenings and new construction to look for archaeological sites and remove them, to get them out of the way of that land development. And it never felt good. Every morning I would wake up and go, am I being a good person doing this? And it just didn't feel right. And finally I ended up doing university teaching when Wilfrid Laurier University opened a Brantford campus. And I ended up in Brantford, and I just retired in 2020. And I'm busier now than when I was teaching. And, you know, how many times have you talked to a retired person and say, I don't know when I had time to work, but that's kind of how it is. So Tanya's a colleague. I've worked with Six Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Huron-Wendat over the last 20 some odd years. I'm not Indigenous. I'm a settler guy, if you want to say that, a white guy, a white folk. And I've learned so much. I learned more from my Indigenous colleagues working with them than I did through all my university studies. And so yeah, I have a PhD, but when I talk with elders in Indigenous communities, it's like they've got 5 PhDs, right? I feel like a 3-year-old or a 2-year-old when I'm in their presence, just the Indigenous knowledge that they have. And the things that, as archaeologists, we invent things, you know, we invent stories to explain just the potsherds and the flakes from making stone tools that we find in the ground, right? We make up stories, and you know what? After you've worked with Indigenous communities for a long enough time, you realize, whoa, we're just doing the armchair speculation that people did back in the 19th century when they didn't know anything. And to be honest, archaeology has a long way to go for that reason, because it's dominated by not Indigenous peoples, not peoples from any other descendant communities. Black Canadians, for example, right? Their archaeology is just beginning to be represented, you know, and they're beginning to get into it themselves to do it. So it's been dominated really by us, the colonizers, and we have to think of ourselves as colonizers. Not saying that we're bad people, we're not. Generally speaking, we're just people. But the entire system, right, really excluded a lot of people, and you know that, right, and continues to do so. We have to be aware of that, and archaeology really is wrestling with that right now. We call it decolonizing archaeology. So what I'm going to be talking about, that's just kind of a preface, but what I'm going to be talking about is something more than just site-specific. So archaeologists, we find stuff, we call it a site, right, like this, if we found a scatter of flakes in this little oval I'm in here, that would be a site, right? And it's a campsite, say it's 9,000 years old. But what we often don't think of as archaeologists is how this site relates to the other site over there, or where was the trail between this camp and whatever other camp that these people who lived here 9,000 years ago traveled to, right? And where did they gather berries from? And where did they bury their dead? It's a landscape, and we don't have that idea at all of the landscape because archaeologists are called in to do a property in advance of development. That's generally what most archaeology is now. And you just have to find the pinpoints on the map, the sites, excavate them, get them out of the way, and then nobody thinks, archaeologists, we're not good about thinking about how that site fits into a much larger landscape that still is important to living Indigenous communities today in this region. And that's something that really gets left out, right? So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about over the next 25 minutes or so. Raj, next slide, please. There's lots of words here. Lots of words here. Tom Andrews and Susan Buggy defined what they were working in the Northwest Territories. Tom Andrews worked with the Dene people for years and years and years out of Yellowknife. He's retired now. But through his work, over 20 some odd years working with the Dene, he was one of the leading archaeologists in Canada back in the day, back in the 1980s, when nobody was thinking about working closely with Indigenous peoples as archaeologists. Tom was doing that because that's it. That's what you do in Yellowknife. It's an Indigenous dominant population. And so he designed this idea of Indigenous cultural heritage landscape. Centers on a people's relationship with the land. That's what Tanya was talking about, right? That Thanksgiving address. It's about thanking the land, right? And acknowledging how tied humans are to the land. That relationship lies in a continuity of association with the land, continuity of access to and activities in the land, continuity of oral traditions and practices, respect for the knowledge and skills of the elders, and engagement of the youth and community in continuity and memory through intergenerational transfer and practice. So it's an ongoing thing. So the archaeology isn't about dead societies or extinct peoples. Those peoples are alive and living today and still value the same things that their ancestors did 10,000 years ago in this place called the Grand River watershed. Right? That's the important thing. That's what they're saying. And so that cultural landscape has to be maintained. And it's been continuous for, in this area, the last 13,000 years. Continuous. There's been continuous Indigenous human presence in the Grand River watershed for 13,000 years. Think about that. Most of our families, if you're not Indigenous, right? My family on both sides came out in the late 19th century out of Britain. That's my roots. That's nothing. That's a blink of an eye compared to 13,000 years, right? So my relationship to the land, I'm still learning. And as I said, some of the best teachers I have, not what I'm learning from archaeology, but what I'm learning from living Indigenous peoples who are still using the land in the same ways that their ancestors did hundreds, thousands of years ago. Truly, truly. So, Raj, next slide, please. So, this is the Grand River watershed. You're familiar with it, right? We're up in the kind of the upper, the middle left of the watershed. But I often say jokingly that the Grand River, it's one of the richest areas archaeologically in North America. It rivals the Mississippi River Valley in terms of the number of archaeological sites and the number of things that are in those archaeological sites. Whether you call them artifacts, archaeologists do. More Indigenous peoples are referring to those artifacts as the belongings of their ancestor. Belongings, right? It's like, whoa, that's different, right? Because to us, we're scientists. It's an artifact, it's a thing, right? Not so. For a lot of Indigenous peoples, those things have a spirit. I mean, they're not just a thing. To us, it's like, that's a thing, right, that I found. It's like, no, not. So I've learned that. I've been taught that, right? And I still can't wrap my Western scientific head around that entirely, but I respect it. I've come to respect it, right? So that's important. So the Grand River is basically two archaeological sites, one on one bank and one on the other, from Lake Erie all the way up past here. And it truly is. It's one of the richest areas, archaeologically speaking, in North America. Raj, next one. So this is tiny little Wilmot Township in that larger, and for you it's home. It's been your home. Maybe, you know, again, your ancestors have been here probably, maybe some of them since it became the Township of Wilmot, what, in 1824, first settled, surveyed, right? Next one, Raj. And you guys, as I said, you're to be commended for your land acknowledgement. There it is up there, right? It's posted on the township website. Also, recently, journalists have acknowledged the Indigenous history of Wilmot Township. Raj, next couple of slides. That one. Next one. And you probably read these articles yourself. Raj, next one, please. Wittenberg, to archaeology, when did it start in Wilmot Township? When did it start in Ontario, right? Well, it doesn't have a really long history. I mean, basically archaeology, the history of archaeology really began in Scandinavia in the 1830s, the way we think of modern archaeology. People before that collected antiquities, especially aristocrats in Europe, princes and kings and queens, right? They would pillage Egypt and Greece and take all that stuff back to Britain or wherever else they were from, right? And put it in a museum. Some of the stuff's still there, but some of those countries want their stuff back, right? Which, yeah, if it was stolen and pillaged, yeah, they deserve to have it back. So in Ontario, that way of looking at the past through the material evidence that's left in the ground, archaeology, was transported here to Canada in the 1860s, 1870s, but it really took off in the 1880s and 1890s. And this guy here, W.J. Wittenberg, William J. Wittenberg, born in New Dundee in 1876, he was kind of a sickly guy. He was the son of a blacksmith. He didn't have the wherewithal, I guess, to pick up the, you know, that iron and pound it on the anvil, right? So he was a book reader, right? And he read lots of books, and he became really interested in Indigenous archaeology. The archaeology of Indigenous peoples, and eventually he ended up with a job at what became the National Museum in Ottawa as an archaeologist. So he began his work, though, here in Wilmot Township. Some of the very first archaeological work by going farm to farm, asking farmers, you know, what did you find on your farm, right? And then he documented it in a series of reports published by the Department of Education in Ontario. Raj, next one. This is an example of one of them, his 1899 report that documents in Waterloo County archaeological sites, and he's published other maps too, which you know are really amazing. He would go farm to farm to farm, documenting archaeological materials. So he started it off, and then archaeology became something you would study at university in the later 20th century, and then now. And Tanya will probably say some words about this after. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but now it's archaeology in advance of development. That's the 95% of archaeology done in Ontario now is archaeology done in advance of land development. So it doesn't give the archaeologists a lot of time to ponder and to publish on what they've found, because it's on to the next job. It's a way to make a living, right? And I'm not slagging my colleagues who do that, because I did that myself for 10 years for the Ministry of Transportation, right? So it's a way to make a living, but still, you feel like there's got to be another way to acknowledge and to try to preserve and save more sites that are part of this larger landscape, right? Because each site you remove from the ground, that's it. It's like tearing a piece out of a history book. Think of it that way. It's tearing every time you remove a site, you're tearing a page out of the Indigenous past of this place, and I mean that, because not every event that Indigenous peoples had, or every aspect of their life, is preserved in a site. We just got relatively small number of archaeological. There's a lot of archaeological sites, but it's a small representation of the Indigenous past, is what I'm saying. So every time a site gets excavated or accidentally removed or damaged, it's ripping a page out of the history book for Indigenous peoples, and you really have to think of it. They have their oral history. I'm not saying, of course, there's oral history, but the history is buried in the ground. in this area for that 13,000 years. That's the importance of it. Yeah, Raj, next one. So you're going to get a whirlwind tour. It starts out 13,000 years ago with the first humans. We have evidence of that at different sites. One of them here is in one of those early sites. It came to light in the early 1990s. My colleague Paul Lennox worked at the Southwest Office of Ministry of Transportation. They were widening Highway 78 and discovered a site dating about 12,000 years old. Small little campsite that's now been removed, and it was removed because they were widening Highway 78, which now, if you drive it out of Kitchener, whatever, that's why it's multi-lane, right? That's what they were doing. So that site is no more, but we do know that these people who hunted caribou in a spruce forest, that's what would have been here, with woolly mammoth and mastodon, those hairy elephants, they were wandering around here at that time. Think about it. Wouldn't that be great to see those things, lumbering through the forest, right? Amazing. So that's how long ago, the ice ages, if you want to call them that, right? From a European point of view, that's how long ago that was, right? Amazing. It's hard for us to imagine. I can't imagine 500 years in the past. I don't know about you. I have difficulty imagining 500 years. How about 1,000? How about 5,000? How about 13,000? No, you lost me. I can't. That's a huge span of time, right? Huge. Raj, next one. So that's called the Alder Creek site. Raj, next one. And that's what was found. That's the actual point that was found from that site, by the way. That's a picture of the point, one of the complete points that was found at that site. Raj, next one, please. Fast forward again, you have a vast period of time called the Archaic. Archaeologists have labeled these time periods. They're not the greatest labels. Indigenous people see them as kind of derogatory or pejorative names. Paleo, Archaic, like what, We need Indigenous peoples to rename those time periods. That's basically, and it's going to happen. Already it's been proposed out west. A colleague of mine, Eldon Yellowhorn, who works he works at Simon Fraser University, but he's done work on the Piegan. He's Blackfoot or Piegan, southern Alberta. And he's proposed new names based on oral history of the Piegan for time periods in the ancient past, right? So that's cool, and we need more of that input, because that's the reality, right? That's really what they should be called, right? Because it's not my past, it's not your past if you're not Indigenous to this area, right? It's the past of living Indigenous peoples who deserve to be naming those time periods after what's culturally meaningful to them in their history, right? As far as I'm concerned, that's how it should be. So this Archaic time period, what happened? Well, the Ice Age ended, the climate changed, it warmed considerably. Ice Age animals like the woolly mammoth and the mastodon went extinct. The caribou moved further north. And they were replaced with what's around us today in a forest, if you go into a bushflat, with the Carolinian Canadian province forest cover, the different maple beech forest, the oak hickory if you're further south on the Grand, with white-tailed deer, and all the critters and the birds and everything that we're familiar with today. That was during the Archaic times, right? So peoples were hunter-gathered and fished in small groups, and life was great. Life was great. And we know that because people in the past have studied their bones and found out that hunter-gatherers of this time period in Ontario were amongst the healthiest populations that the world has seen. I mean, that's how productive the environment was and how conscious they were of keeping their population in balance with what nature could provide in this region, right? It was a relationship. Raj, next one, please. This map here, it's from a student. It doesn't have anything to do with Wilmot Township, but I want to impress on you that the vast period of time of the Archaic people and the Paleo people, they would camp at the same spot over and over and over again. Raj, next one, please. And on the Lower Grand, the student, Eric Tincombe, I served on his MA committee at McMaster. He plotted those archaic sites for the Lower Grand next to walleye spawning beds and white-tailed deer yarding areas. A very important fishery and the white-tailed deer for their livelihood. Raj, next one. And what he found, those yellow dots are archaic sites, and the red areas from Ministry of Natural Resource data are the deer yarding areas. in the Brantford area. Raj, next one, please. And so there you see with the walleye spawning beds, the blue on the Oxbow bend of the Grand River. You see a smattering, a scattering of archaic sites, and then again in those same areas by the deer yarding areas. So they're mapping on, and they've mapped on to this is over the span too. These sites, by the way, are over the span of 2,000 years. So that's 2,000 years of activity of the mapping onto the same locations over and over again, right? So you can build up a map if you get enough sites and you have enough data on the environment. You can begin to establish, okay, why are these sites where they are? What were people doing there? And how many people were there anyway? Raj, next one, please. Fast forward again in time, and we hit what's called the woodland period. Woodland period is distinguished from that early archaic period. Why? Archaeologists were kind of weird that way about material culture, but we see pottery, clay pottery for the first time, right? And you think, okay, yeah, that's an innovation. Yeah, it is an innovation, but that's how we distinguish the woodland period, right? So for the first part of the woodland period, up until 1,500 years ago, people were still hunter-gatherer fishers, except they were using pottery rather than not using pottery, right? That's the only really thing distinguishing the middle woodland early from the archaic. But about 1,500 years ago, Raj, next one, please. Maize or corn, we call it corn, but its technical term is maize. If you want to be, use the Latin terminology, zea maize, M-A-Y-S, right? That's the Linnaean taxonomic biological classification for next time you're eating a cob of corn, you're eating zea maize, right? So you could say that to your family members, right? Can you pass another cob of zea maize, please? So it came in about 1,500 years ago. How do we know this? From carbonized remains on sites that are called Princess Point sites. Why? Because the very first site the archaeologists found was at Princess Point in the Hamilton area, right? So, but they're all over the Lower Grand, from Cambridge on down. But there are small camps with Princess Point pottery that have been identified up this far in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. So not villages growing maize, not the villages, but certainly the hunting areas were up here. So the Lower Grand was for the farming, and they would come up here to hunt. We know that from this few sites that are being found. And there's more and more and more of them that turn up. Raj, next one. By about 1000 AD, they left the Grand River. They left the floodplains. They were kind of tethered to the floodplains with their maize agriculture, the Princess Point people, if we can call them that, but that's a misnomer. So let's just call them late woodland people. By 1000 years CE, so in the Common Era, we begin to see palisaded longhouse villages. Things that we recognize are similar to what it's described by the French missionaries and explorers that were in this area when they visited the Neutral. They were called the Neutral. That's the Attawandaron, which isn't the name the Neutral gave themselves. That's the name in the Huron-Wendat language that the Huron-Wendat called them. And it means people who speak a slightly different dialect. You might also have seen the word Chanonton. We can have a discussion after. I don't have time to get into that word, right? But it appears on one Samuel de Champlain map, and that's it. It's never referred to again in any of the historical literature. But some people have used that as the name that the Neutral called themselves. But there's a debate. There's a debate about that. So that lasted until approximately in 1650. 51, really, was the last Neutral Attawandaron independent villages in the Grand River watershed. What happened? There was a series of diseases that swept through all of the Northeast North America. It killed off 2/3 of all the indigenous peoples in Northeast North America in the 1630s. Think about that. Think about your own family, your large extended family. Think 5 years from now, there's going to be a 1/3 of you left. Irrespective of age, right? Killed the little ones, killed the old ones, killed the ones in between. You think COVID was bad? Nothing. Nothing on this. It would have devastated. It's historically unprecedented. Those epidemics, the disease, the death rates. Historically, even the Black Death in Europe didn't kill as many people. Think about that. As devastating as the Black Death was in the middle of the 1300s, it wasn't as bad as this. So it completely disrupted the entire political system, the relationships between peoples, the relationships between people and the land, the relationships between people and the spirit world, right? Completely disrupted that. It was a shock that they'd never, ever, ever experienced before, right? As I said, historically unprecedented globally, right? So that created a huge disruption in things, right? So there was warfare. People were trying to replenish their numbers through peaceful negotiations and then eventually through force. Because why? They were afraid if they didn't, like the Haudenosaunee, they could see the Dutch coming, they could see the English coming, shiploads of them, the French down the St. Lawrence, shiploads every year. They thought, we're going to lose our independence, our autonomy. We're going to be swamped over by these white-skinned people coming off these sailing ships, right? Unless we bolster our numbers and remain independently strong, right? So they convinced and took and captive, through captives, and eventually the Haudenosaunee and the Huron-Wendat were really the main peoples who survived those terrible times. And Ontario had a history in the 17th, 18th century of Haudenosaunee people, Huron-Wendat, and neutral Attawandaron being incorporated into the Haudenosaunee. Then the Haudenosaunee came back in the late 1600s, lived on the North Shore of Lake Ontario for 20 or 30 years. Then the Mississaugas came down from up north. This is what the Mississauga oral history even talks about, right? Came down and pushed the Haudenosaunee back south of Lake Ontario and occupied this area. And that's why when the British came in the 1700s, they saw Mississaugas people living in this area on the Grand at the head of Lake Ontario, on the North Shore of Lake Ontario, right? But it truly is a shared territory, and Indigenous peoples today talk about that. On the Haudenosaunee side, on the Anishinaabe Mississauga side, right? It's a shared, and that dish with one spoon that's in your land, that's what it talks about. They peacefully coexist in this area, sharing the land. Nobody owns it. From an Indigenous perspective, ownership of land is not you can't divide it up and sell it. It'd be like saying, this is my air, I'm breathing. No, none of you can have it. This little thing here is my little cloud of air, right? How crazy is that? If I claim that, right? Crazy. So that's how you have to begin to appreciate that that's how we think. So we're all sharing this place, but we also have a mutual responsibility to care for it for everybody else, right? If it's not yours, it's not mine, it's all of ours, well, yeah, we got to care for it for everybody, right? And so that's an interesting concept, right? And certainly we see this in the archaeological record. Raj, next one, please. So this is, if you're familiar with Kitchener-Waterloo, everyone thinks, I've got from school teachers over the past, Gary, are you involved with those digs on Fisher-Hallman, right? That are, it's like, no, I'm not, but I know about them, right? I've visited them. Well, the archaeologists are out there, but they're basically neutral or Attawandaron villages, which there's a lot of in this area, that were basically occupied between about 1350 and the early 1500s. And then the Attawandaron moved from Kitchener-Waterloo. Why? We don't know. We don't know. To move further south and east into Brant County, where they were encountered eventually in the 17th century by French Jesuit missionaries, and before that, even explorers like Etienne Brulé. Raj, next one, please. So these are the kinds of artifacts that you get, or belongings, if you want to honor how Indigenous peoples think of them, right? So pottery, stone tools, bone tools. Raj, next one, please. We can trace the where the longhouses were in the village. Raj, next one, please. It leaves stains in the ground. So you dig a pit, you put ash in it, like this thing, from one of the sites at Fisher-Hallman. That's a longhouse. And you can trace the longhouse because every time you put a post in the ground and you pull it out, or it decomposes, it leaves a circular stain in the ground that you can trace. If you cut it in half, you can see that it's like shoving a picket in the ground, a post in the ground. And so it's a ghost image. And by tracing the ghost images, you can trace out where the longhouses were. It's pretty amazing. And in your mind, as an archaeologist, we try to imagine what they would have looked like above ground, right? Because all we've got is at ground level, right, where they were. Raj, next one, please. This is an excavation I participated in Flamborough area. 1300s period house, so about 700 years old. It gives you a sense, of we're excavating the interior of it. Look how big it is. And I'm standing not at the end of that house. That house ended up being about 70 meters long. That's short relative to some of the houses. The Coleman site, not far from here, near New Dundee, was excavated in the 1980s by Rob McDonald for his MA thesis. The house he got there was 124 meters long. It's the longest longhouse we know about in the entire northeast North America. 124 meters. Imagine being at one end and going, "Hey, what are you doing tonight?" You know, like, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? That's the length of over the length of a soccer or football field, right? Crazy. But that's what their life was like in these houses. Raj, next one, please. So they've been reconstructed in modern times through drawings and descriptions by Europeans. Different forms get reconstructed. The one on the bottom is Crawford Lake near Campbellville. I encourage you to go to Crawford Lake Conservation Area and see for yourself. They've done an amazing job reconstructing the houses. And the other one's from Gunundagon, which is a site in Seneca site in New York State. It was destroyed by the French, actually, in the 1680s. They burned it to the ground. Raj, next one, please. So, Longhouse Villages, I'm going to talk a bit about the landscape. This is an artist depiction of an early site, say on the Grand River. It's not the Grand River, it's on the St. Lawrence River, but I always say to people it's on the Grand River. But you can see the maize field carved out of the forest in the back of the houses, right? And how close the houses are to the river. Raj, next one, please. This is a reconstruction of a Seneca site at Babby Point in Toronto, occupied by the Seneca in the 1670s. And you can see again how close the maize fields are in this artist reconstruction to the houses, but how close the forest is. And so this is my attempt to show the village is the square, and the fields are the stippled areas, the ovals, in a D shape around the village, and then you can see the forest is very close too. That's not a European way of farming, is it? If any of you come from farms, right, you've got your farmhouse near the lane, you know, near the concession road or whatever, right? Do you have forest right beside the farmhouse and near your barn? No. Where's the forest? It's at the back, right? You plant your fields as close as you can to your house. These guys did that too, but they also knew the forest is just as important for building supplies, for firewood, for medicinal plants, for animals, for you name it, right? You name it. The forest is just as important. So they were farmers, but they were hunter-gatherer fishers at the same time. Again, perfect in terms of their health. And I see Mary Jakes is in the audience. Mary, putting you on the spot, Mary. But Mary is a bioarchaeologist who has studied in the past, studied the remains, the skeletal remains of Iroquois peoples. And to be honest, they're pretty darn healthy compared with other peoples in other parts of the world, right? Because they had both the farming and the hunting, gathering, fishing as well, right? That relationship to that. And they kept their numbers in relationship to what nature could provide. They could have been farmers and ended up farming everything and growing into big civilizations, but they chose not to do that. Deliberately, they chose not to do that. Yeah, Raj? So this is Emily Damstra, as an artist in Kitchener-Waterloo. Her, these 4 panels here describe clearing the land, planting the land, having the land, you know, be productive agriculturally, and then letting the land grow fallow again, and letting the forest grow up again. So if you're doing that, you know, you tell me what farmer is going to let their land grow up into forest. You'd be out of business, wouldn't you, right? Unless you moved and bought another farm, right, and did the same thing again, right? But that's what these people did. The Attawandaron, the neutral in this area, and the Haudenosaunee, and all the other Iroquois-speaking peoples. So they moved their villages every 10, 20, or 30 years to a new location and start all over again. And let the old village and all its fields and everything else just grow back into forest again to replenish itself. Pretty amazing, pretty green way of living, right? But can you have thousands and thousands of people packed in doing that? No, you got to limit your population, and they deliberately did that. Raj, next one, please. Next one, Raj. There. What have I just circled there? Does that look familiar to you? There's Lake Erie, there's Lake Ontario, Hamilton, Burlington. That's 6 nations of the Grand River where the Haudenosaunee live, right? That, you can see it from space. You can see it from space. Why? Because they've kept the forest deliberately near them. Even to this day, they're doing that, right? Yeah, they might be on a postage stamp reserve, as it's called, but they still have that relationship that their ancient ancestors did with the land, of keeping... They have farms, there's farming that goes on there, but there's a lot of forest there too. Well, take a look. You can see the outline of the community just by where the forests are. Yep, Raj, next one, please. When they hunted, there wasn't, in this area, as far as we know, a lot of what's called white oak savanna and prairie. It was further south, North Dumfries, Brant County, all the way down to Long Point. That's a reconstruction on the left. There you see Long Point going up through Brant County. All those green areas are historically recorded oak savanna. The little red areas are all that's left. So it just shows you how much is gone. Oak savanna has to be burned, and it is burned by people. Natural forest fires don't maintain oak savanna. So when the first surveyors came through here in the 19th century, they recorded oak parkland. Oh, you could drive a carriage through, right? A wagon, no problem, through those parts of southwestern Ontario. What were they? They were hunting areas. We know this because early 19th century naturalists and other people would talk to Indigenous people and say, why are these things here? Oh, we maintain them. Why do you maintain them? For deer hunting. But that's been forgotten because the oak savannas have gone the way of the dodo bird, just like a lot of the other important indigenous places like wetlands, right, that have been drained for farmland, right? There's a whole host of things that Indigenous peoples relied on in the past that the landscape has changed. The new arrivals, the settlers that came in, just changed everything, right? Trying to make it little Europe again. Really, that's what it is. That's what we do as human beings. We try to make things look like where we've left. And you can think of lots of examples in history where people have done that, right? And certainly that's what Europeans did. They made what's called a neo-Europe here in North America, right? And certainly in southern Ontario. You look around the vegetation, except for some of the trees, all the plants you'll see are imports. Weeds. The weeds are European imports, right? For the most part. Seeds that came over with the first immigrants, right? So it changed the entire landscape. Raj, next one, please. Yeah, William Pope, he's describing, what he was told, why they burned the oak savannas for deer. Thank you. Raj, next one, please. That's just an example of deer hunting. My cousin, he's an avid hunter. He had a place up near North Bay, and I'm not into hunting. I wouldn't know the first thing. I'd be shooting myself with my gun if I went out there. So I leave it to other people. I enjoy venison. I've had venison. I enjoy it as people gift it to me. But when he described how he hunts, right, and it's like, okay, well, how did you learn to do? Oh, I learned it from Dad. Okay, and who'd you learn that from? Well, he learned it from these old white guys, right? And then, okay, who did they learn it from? And eventually, if you trace it back far enough, you know what? I bet someone's going to say, oh, I learned it from this Indigenous hunter, right? About how to do that, right? How you move through the forest, making lots of noise at a certain time of the year, when the fall, prime deer hunting time, right? For Indigenous peoples, and they learn. So don't let someone tell you that, 19th century pioneer settlers in this area were hunters. Because when we look at log cabins archaeologically from the 19th century, of Mennonites, of Irish people, the Scottish people, doesn't matter what ancestry, Germans, when you look at the refuse behind their cabins from the 1830s, are you seeing lots of deer? No, you're seeing none. Are you seeing lots of fish? No, you're seeing none. Are you seeing lots of passenger pigeons? Nope, you're seeing none. When you look at an 1830s Haudenosaunee cabin, what are you seeing? 95%. 95% of the animal bones around that cabin are wild game, deer, fish, birds, wild birds, right? That's who was doing the hunting. So there's this myth that we carry around in our heads, right, as settlers, that, oh yeah, it's Davy Crockett, they were out there in the forest hunting. No, they weren't. The archaeology tells the truth. That's the thing. The archaeology tells it. It's like being a forensic detective. You can say, oh yeah, the murder occurred here. And you go and go, I can't find anything. I'm a detective. I'm a forensic guy. There's nothing here, right? It couldn't have happened here. That's the same thing that an archaeologist can do, right? We can look at the ground and go, no, that's a myth. That's a myth. Or a lie. Even worse, a lie. Raj? Fishing went on the Nith River in this area. would have been perfect. The Grand River certainly. Would there have been weirs? Yeah, but they've been swept out by flooding and over the last 170 years or so, right? So we can't reconstruct where they would have fished, but there's prime fishing locations, and you can find archaeological sites clustered, like the walleye spawning beds that I showed you, right? Clustered around those that are still used by walleye to spawn. They were used 2,000 years ago to spawn. Same parts of the river, right? The Grand River is amazing. It stayed pretty well in the same channel over the last 10,000 years. That's remarkable. It's not like the Mississippi River Valley. It was going all over the place, right? Grand's a pretty stable river over the last 10,000 years. So that's one advantage we can use as archaeologists to say, well, what's here today? Was it there 5,000 years ago? Chances are, yeah. Yeah. Raj, next one. So sturgeon, once upon a time before all the dams were built on the Grand, they swam up from Lake Erie and spawned. Raj, yep, and they fished through jackknife fishing. At Davisville, where I excavated in northwestern Brantford in the early 2000s, a community, Mohawk Mississauga community, occupied in the 1820s primarily. There's a mention from Peter Jones, a Mississauga Methodist missionary. He went out fishing with one of his buddies, jackknife fishing, right, at night. They caught 120 fish in the Brantford area. One night of fishing. Wow, that's pretty good going, right? Raj, next one. So fishing goes on. This is from the early 20th century. Someone spearfishing. Raj? We also find net sinkers. So they were sinking nets into the Grand as well to catch fish that way. Seine fishing. Raj, next one, please. Sugar, maple sugaring. We just went through maple sugaring, right? Maybe some of you have a sugar bush, right? But again, that was something Indigenous peoples did, that they taught the Europeans. Here's what you can do with these maple trees, right? Got to be the right kind, but you can produce sugar from them if you follow this. So those camps are out there somewhere. We don't know where they are, though, because it wouldn't leave much of a trace archaeologically. Raj? This is in kind of the Wilmot Waterloo Township area, but what I've done here is those in the middle of those are Attawandaron neutral villages, and that's the circles around them, different time periods, going from 1400 to 1500. Those are the agricultural, what I showed you earlier, the agricultural fields, and the other areas for medicinal plants, part of the forest that would have been around and used by that community. So you can see that they don't generally overlap. Do you see that? They don't overlap. Why? Because those areas are regenerating. So when they moved out of the 1400, the blue ones, they would move to the red ones, and then from the red ones to the yellow ones, right? That's the pattern that you're seeing here, right? I can't tell you which moved where. We don't have enough data from those sites. But if you did collect the data, you could probably reconstruct. And some people have actually, excuse me, some people have actually looked at designs on pottery and tried to identify individual potters that might have been at one village and then moved to another village. Because if they were going every 20 or 30 years, you'd still be alive, right, doing your potting. And women were the potters, by the way. Women made the pottery. So you could maybe identify individual potters and say, okay, this woman moved from here to here, so therefore they moved the village from this one to this one, right? We're not there yet, but what I'm telling you is we could do that with existing collections of pottery. We don't have to do new excavation. All the pottery is in museums and research facilities that students now are studying, rather than excavating more and more sites, which is destructive of that landscape record, right? You can use the existing collections that were collected 100 years ago by Winterberg, and people have used them. People have looked at those collections. Raj, next one, please. This is my attempt to reconstruct population, and you can't really read the scale there, but the top is 4,000 people. This is for the entire Grand River watershed. So yet never, ever in the history of Indigenous peoples in this area, going right to the 18th, 19th century of Six Nations of the Grand River, you never had more than 4,000 people living in the Grand River watershed. What's that telling you? That's telling you they're living in a very sustainable way. And that's kind of the population that we should have if we really wanted to be green. And so, you know what? Like, all of us have to move out of here and, lower the population to 4,000 again, right? No, I'm being ridiculous. But it's interesting, isn't it? When you actually do the numbers and look and go, oh, that's an interesting relationship that they had with the land. Raj, next one, please. So this is just showing the dish with one spoon. In historic times, the Mississaugas of the Haudenosaunee shared the Grand River watershed. Raj? The Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, settled the lower part of the Grand from Cambridge on down pretty well. This area up here was used for hunting. We know that through historical records. Joseph Brant, for example, had areas that he preferred to hunt up here. So that's what it would have been up here, but they would have used the land. Certainly the Mississaugas were here when the Mennonites got here. In fact, it was probably Mississaugas who showed the Mennonites where to settle. And some of the historical information. Reg Good, if you know him, he's a historian from Kitchener-Waterloo area, and he's written some papers on that, right, using oral histories and archival materials. And yeah, I mean, basically the Mennonites were taken by the hand and said, here, you know, here's a good place to live. And it was already clear, too, because the Mississaugas, you know, were using it for growing maize. They grew maize, too. They weren't just hunter-gatherer fishers. Raj, next one, please. So where did they settle? Well, they settled in the same areas where their ancestors were. This is in southern Brantford, along the Grand River. If you're familiar with the area, Bell Homestead is just to the left, to the south. So we're looking west, up the river there. Brantford would be to the right of that photo there. But that whole field is an archaeological site. It's 300-400 years of early Princess Point. Remember the first maize farmers from 500 to 1000 AD? That whole field is covered in material. And also, Raj, next one, please. So that's Princess Point. Next one. It's also covered in an 1800 to 1840s Cayuga settlement. We know that from doing collection just off the surface of the site. We collected all the artifacts off the surface of that site, and that's how we determine. And there's also earlier material there, too, from the archaic time periods, right? So one area that was good to live in. Why? There's bald eagles there, by the way. Bald eagles, I don't know if you know about bald eagles, but they're kind of carrion birds. They're a little bit like vultures. Everyone thinks of them, these proud birds that do a lot of hunting, right? And scooping fish out of the live fish out of the water. If there's a dead fish washed up in the shallows, they'll eat it, right? They'll swoop down and eat it. And if you don't believe me, read about bald eagle behavior, right? So, national bird of the U.S., right? They're proudly, you know, oh, we got this. It eats dead fish, right? But that's okay. So, bald eagles are coming back in this area. Why? Because this is a prime location for fishing. Anglers still go there in the scores to fish there. It would have been a great area for fishing, right? So great area for fishing in the past, all the way back to archaic times, probably, right? It's quite close to the to that walleye spawning bed as well, right? Raj, next one. So this is a map of entire Waterloo County, but showing you where the different Attawandaron sites are, but also showing you where trails might have been. That's the dashed red lines. That's my attempt. The green areas are oak savanna, hunting areas, deer hunting areas. The brown outlined areas are areas of pine forest that would have indicated fields, old fields, that would still have grown up into even-age stands of pine by the time land surveyors got there in the early 1800s. So they're seeing a ghost image of where the fields were around those villages from about 1500. Amazing, isn't that amazing? So 300 years later, you know, they're still seeing the ghost image of those maize fields that would have been surrounding those Attawandaron village sites, right? Pretty remarkable. Yeah, Raj, next one, please. So all of this, though, you probably don't know much of what I've just been telling you because it got erased when the settlers came in and we just erased everything. Our ancestors did, right? They were trying to make a living and develop farms and mills and dam rivers and drain wetlands and create towns and settlements, and before you knew it, they'd removed a lot of the signs. The oak savanna's gone, the wetlands are gone, archaeological sites get destroyed, and they don't see them, right? And so an Indigenous archaeologist, Sarah Hunt, described them as colonial scapes, and this is from her PhD dissertation. And she says, you know, space now called Canada, which perpetuate and manifest colonial expressions of power. Colonial scapes says cover over. They cover over. other spatial relations and representations, as the colonial view blankets over these prior and deeper spatial orders. So it's the Indigenous landscapes that I've been talking about that get covered over. Raj, next one. Why? Because it was people like Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland who wanted that to happen, right? He deliberately put lies back to the main office. I know from my excavations at Davisville, I told you, the Davisville Mohawk cabins of the look at the date on there, 1821, of the 1820s at Davisville. 95% of the bone outside the cabins is deer and wild game. What's he saying? Oh, they don't hunt anymore. That's a lie. I wish I could go back in time and say, I've got archaeological evidence, right? I'm from the future, right? This guy's lying. I mean, I wouldn't need to do that because you go to Davisville and they're hunting, right? So it's these lies that got sent back to the Home Office in London that allowed those Indigenous landscapes to be removed, right? We're not privy to that, are we? We just look at this document and go, yeah, I guess they weren't hunting anymore. Nobody bothered to ask Indigenous peoples, is that true in your oral history? Were you not hunting anymore at that time in this area? Or an archaeologist? Gary, what are you finding? Lots of animal bones from the forest, right? In the 1820s. So yeah, I think they were hunting. Raj? Next one, please. So this is the next one, Raj. So this is the landscape, and this is what we honor in terms of heritage, right? We almost forget. And there's been a criticism, I know, maybe 10, 20 years ago, it was common to start the clock in terms of human history for this area with the Mennonites. That was very common, right? Just have to go back to history books written at that time, 20, 30 years ago, right? There's barely a mention of an Indigenous past, right? And so it got removed. And if we're not careful, it gets forgotten, right? Archaeology is a way of bringing that back to light and saying, hey, what the Indigenous peoples are saying in terms of their oral history, we're finding that scientifically in the ground, right? Not that we have to do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't have to do that. The oral history should stand on its own, but what it does over and over again is corroborates what has been said by Indigenous peoples, counter to those historical lies that I showed you from Lieutenant Governor Peregrine Maitland, right? Who had ulterior motives for sending that information, that false information back. Yep, Raj? So, Six Nations, they were confined to a small postage stamp, 48,000 acres as opposed to almost 1 million acres in the Haldeman Proclamation. Raj, next one. Next one, Raj. So you can see it got whittled down. That little red area is Six Nations of the Grand River. That's the Haudenosaunee. That's the original Haldeman tract, right? That's what's left now in their control. Tanya will probably say something more about that. Raj? So, Sarah Hunt, although the land was imagined as empty, made to be legally empty, we know through Indigenous people's lived experiences, oral histories, legal relations, and I might add, and archaeology, that the land was not empty. It was indeed rich with life that goes back to time immemorial, not back to the date of Canada's removal. Raj, next one. Carolyn King, you may have heard her talk. She has an idea about putting stencils of moccasins on to commemorate sites, like on the sides of buildings or on roadways or sidewalks or school grounds, to remind people that there was an Indigenous presence here, to commemorate archaeological sites even that way. Because once sites are removed, they're gone. Once the archaeologists leave and take all the things they found with them, it's very rare for local people even to know what happened. You get the news article while they're out there digging, and then what happened anyway? What did they really find there? Archaeologists aren't good about getting the word out. We're terrible, in fact. We really are. You know, we're pretty bad. I've got some colleagues who are not bad about doing it, but it's rare, right? We need to be doing a better job that way. And Paul General, my friend, colleague, he published this, right? But first time I heard it, we were having corn soup lunch on Six Nations, right? And I don't know how we got talking about, hunting and farmers being, getting all irate of Indigenous hunters on their land, and he told me this story. One day he worked for the Lands and Resources Office, similar to Tanya. Tanya's working in the same office. And he got this call from this really angry farmer saying, "Hey, why are you guys hunting at the back of my farm? They didn't get permission to be back there, and I don't want them there." And he just kept going on and on at Paul. And Paul, if you've ever met him, he's very low-key, and nothing irks him or rankles him very much, but he said this guy was just getting to him, right? So Paul said, he didn't say it angrily, but it just came out of me. He said, he reminded the farmer, he said, they're not hunting on your farm. Your farm's on their hunting land, right? And of course, the angry farmer just smashed the phone down, right? But when Paul told me that story, it changed my life. I'm not kidding you. I just thought, wow, that's just a total reversal of everything I learned in school, right? About being a Canadian, a settler Canadian, right? It just really changed me. It was profound. And so I'm leaving you with that, and Tanya will pick it up from there.
Thank you, Gary. No, that was really good. So I could talk about myself forever, but I won't. So I'm actually, my Western knowledge, I'm actually a criminologist. And I said to Gary, because Gary actually was my professor at one point, and I said, Gary, there's more crime in archaeology than there is in criminology. But anyhow, so today I actually brought with me, so Indigenous people, like us women, we like to carry pouches with us. So today I brought with me my pouch. So a lot of times we put into our pouches everything that means something to us. And today, speaking in this area and speaking about landscapes, I thought, well, what more important is to talk about our connection to the land, the connection to ecology, the connection to our natural environment, and why is it a connection, right? So I brought this with me today just to show some of the things that are important to me. So I brought artifacts, and I'm going to talk about these artifacts because these we do not have in our community, which is really, horrible for me to have to tell you guys. The artifacts are actually the property of Ontario, and we do not, at Six Nations, have access to our own heritage, our own culture. We don't have access to it. It's in a storage unit, and it's also in an SA. It's in a box in somebody's basement. But Six Nations does not have artifacts to be able to carry on our oral tradition, our sacred, materials for ceremony. It's all in museum, and it's very unfortunate. So how I actually got these artifacts was a really nice family said, my dad, he's 90 years old, he lives on the Grand River, he wanted to give back to the community. He didn't want to see his collection go back to a museum or in a storage facility. He says, these need to go back to the community. So last year, his daughter dropped these off at our Lands and Resources office, and I was like, this is great. I said, because now with our monitoring program, I actually have artifacts to be able to teach our monitors who are going out on site. Because right prior to this, I started this position in 2020. I had to try my best to be able to teach our monitors who went out on site, this is what a point looks like. This is what a scraper looks like. And it was really hard because we couldn't, learning, there's texture, there's so much features to artifacts that you can't get out of a piece of paper. So that's the unfortunate part for Six Nations and any other community, that our heritage is not even in our possession. So I brought some of these today so everyone could kind of sort of look at them because they're pretty cool. For me, I wouldn't be able to name these. I ain't going to say this is a Daniel's Point or this is, because that's not important to me. What's important to me is what we utilize these for. And, I don't know where the names come from, because I'm quite sure that our ancestors didn't say, well, this could be a Clovis point and this is what we're going to call this today, right? So I know that's probably didn't happen in our camps from our ancestors. So again, as Gary mentioned earlier, of us, being transient people, not reaping the resources completely, depleting them in areas, we would travel to different areas. Once we knew that this area is becoming depleted, we would move to another area because we respected Mother Earth and we knew when it was time to move to a different area. So I brought cedar with me today because cedar, again, back to that landscape, there's something in our natural environment that was helpful. And we knew how to live, off of medicinal medicines or, our trees, our waters. So cedar's really important to us because, it's a medicinal plant. We can drink this as a tea and, get better from infection, whatnot. So there's always something that's in the environment that's helpful for us. Tobacco, as I arrived here today, I was given an offering, which is that's very respectful because that's what we do to our Creator. We thank the Creator and we provide them with, we provide them with tobacco. That's our offering. So even on archaeological sites today, I give offerings all the time. As soon as I step out onto the site, I don't do it where everybody sees me do it, but I go onto the archaeological site and I provide an offering because we knew our ancestors at some point was there. We got evidence in the ground somebody was there where we're finding materials. So tobacco is very sacred to us. This is like the highest, property to us, our tobacco. So again, we provide that to our ancestors if we're out on site. The animals, again, as I said in the Thanksgiving address, we thanked our animals because the deer gave us this hide. We've used the hide for many different purposes. The cedar, the sage we use all the time for, just cleansing. So, that again, as you can see, the description I'm given, we utilized our natural environment, and that's what was important to us. So, yeah, I wanted to make sure that I showed you all my bundle here today. Pine today, we still use pine. I still put pine above all my doorways because growing up through ceremony, we were always to put pine above our doorways, and it kept the bad spirits out because we're spiritual people, right? The feather, we use animal feather to help cleanse and help with our ceremonies. The shell, I brought the shell, I was showing Gary, we use the shell. So again, everything that I have with me today, we utilized, and it was a part of our natural environment. A dime, I have no idea why I have a dime in here. It must have dropped in here. We definitely didn't utilize that, right? But yeah, at some point you can come and, take a look at what my sacred bundle is. And I have to thank the 90-year-old gentleman on the Grand River who decided to say, you know what, we're going to step out of our elements and we're not going to let Ontario say that Indigenous people can't have their heritage. And so I'm thankful for him because now with the monitors I'm able to say, this is what an artifact looks like, because a lot of our Indigenous people, we never have been able to even actually view any of the heritage because again it's been written out of history, as Gary said, right? And a lot of my position with one of Gary's slides where you looked at the beautiful building, I advocate really strongly to say, what's beneath the ground? Right now we're doing heritage conservation district areas for protection. Well, we're protecting a built building. Yes, that's okay, but that's not okay for Indigenous people. Let's look at protection for the archaeology that's under the ground. And a lot of time with different areas where in the name of development they go in and wipe that area out, or if there is a situation where a developer can't afford to fully mitigate the area, we'll call it, he'll say, okay, let's void and protect it. Or if we come across burial, let's avoid it and protect the area. But again, that same acknowledgement's not there, that same protection. A lot of times I could say there's a lot of areas that don't even have mapping of saying that, okay, don't go to this area, like Meyer site, you know, like don't go there, you know, there's burial there, but, you know, that same protection is not there. But I will say that Ontario bereavement authorities have stepped up and said, hey, Tanya, there's something we have to do better to acknowledge Indigenous burial. So there's a lot of change that's taking place. It's, you know, it's still not where it should be, but we're moving forward with that. But yeah, if you guys have a chance to come and look at it, every one of these artifacts at some point, as Gary even mentioned, you know, we had ceremony all the time, no matter what we did. So I would say that before we went out and hunted, this right here would have had a ceremony done with it. Our ancestors would have given thanks to the Creator, would have gave thanks to the animal before the hunt. He would have gave thanks to having a successful hunt. So every one of these, I've spoke to them, I've gave them offering. I said that, you know what, we're here today for a teaching tool, and, you know, we're going to continually benefit and learn from this material today. So the ceremony was conducted on this. I'm guarantee it was, because again, we're spiritual people. So yeah, before we went out and hunt, we definitely would have had a ceremony. So for me, I grew up, again, I'll talk about, you know, myself a little bit, because I like talking about myself. But I was a criminologist, so I go into this position, and I always want to give thanks to, you know, where I came from, and that's important, how we also Indigenous people with respect, right? So again, I come with you guys today. I gave thanks with the Thanksgiving address. I want to give thanks to Joanne Thomas, because Joanne Thomas is who I took after this role. And Joanne, unfortunately, I was heading off to Western society knowledge, and, you know, and Gary could probably attest to this. When I was in university, I grew up with a lot of traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, and my dad was he buried people in our community for 50 years. He just retired. He's 73 years old now. So I grew up with a lot of ceremony, and, you know, I got to the point in my life where I'm like, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to, you know, give thanks to, you know, or have a feast and bring back our dead to the table and, you know, send him back on his journey. And I grew up with a lot of that, so I kind of got to the point where I was like, no, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. But, you know, it all came back to me after all these years. So I went into university. I took a lot of zeros, but I passed. I got a lot of, I don't think I even got a D anymore, because I, you know, reasoned with my professor. But I went in there and we had Indigenous knowledge courses, and I'm like, no, I don't really think that's true, right? But they have to teach on a I guess, evidence-based, you know, peer-reviewed aspect of it, right? So Indigenous knowledge never got that, right? So I had to kind of fake it. One of my professors took me to the side, and they said, well, Tanya, you know, you just got to pretend that you're viewing yourself now, and just to get past all of this, right? But I'm like, I'm still not convinced that's right, you know, but we made it through. I got out with, you know, A's and B's and one D that I made a B again. So for Indigenous people, our perspective is on the landscape. And today I'll provide, you know, from Indigenous person. When we speak of the landscape, we think of the respect of the land, giving thanks to Mother Earth for all she has provided. The landscape of the land in particular we speak today is Wilmot and Kitchener area. So the landscape, again, for Wilmot, again, we would utilize what you've seen, you know, me present there with our artifacts and our sacred materials, that all of that we would have utilized in our camp. We didn't, you know, have any other way but a social structure where we knew how to build something to get through, and or not even just build and construct a camp, but also to carve out of, you know, raw material, stone, to something to be able to hunt with, right? So I believe we were pretty smart people. So the landscape is part of our ceremonies, our songs, our language, our drumming in our ceremony. So a lot of time, like I just attended the maple syrup ceremony. Tomorrow I have to go to another one at 7 o'clock, another ceremony with Jan Longboat, which some of the people would know in this area, Jan, because Jan has come out and spoke a few times in this area. So yeah, we went through the maple syrup. We heard the thunders. So we knew once we have those ceremonies that it's now the new season. So as soon as we heard the thunders, we had to have our ceremony, and we don't have the ceremony till after that. So in our ceremonies and songs, we give thanks to all the elements, in which I read earlier the Thanksgiving address in English. So our landscape is not the science. We didn't go and research back and look at this item and study it and try to figure it out. We had a purpose for it. So science to me is the study of people and a study of their way of life and their social structure. So again, that key word is the study. When we go out into the field, we're trying to, as archaeologists studied us, we're out there, our representatives through the program. We're like providing the Indigenous perspective of, what you would have used that, why would we have utilized that tool, right? And it was really difficult because, again, I'll go and I'll circle back to Paul General and Joanne Thomas. So in 2016, 2015, Joanne was an aspiring archaeologist who said, I have a vision. I have, a vision of now incorporating Indigenous people's perspective into archaeology, which was never there before, and I have to give her thanks because she pioneered this program that I took after. And I might say that I've never met Joanne Thomas. I started in 2020. COVID hit. I met in January in the office. February, COVID hit. March, Joanne got really sick. And then unfortunately, Joanne passed in April. And I never did, I just got into this, taking her spot, paving her path that she left. And I never had any guidance. So I had to learn everything, that she pioneered and she created for this archaeological program. So the archaeology program is through Lands and Resources, as Gary mentioned. And, it's very successful now. We have really changed a lot of colonial mindsets to say, oh, okay, this is why you guys are here, because it's really difficult for people to even understand why do we have Indigenous people here, because history for some started at Christopher Columbus, which is I learned that. Then nobody talks about contact, pre-contact, nothing like that. They just talk about Christopher Columbus came here and this is how it is, right? So I'm glad that I have these opportunities to talk, to be able to share that, Indigenous people were here way before all of that those kind of stuff that we learn in history. So again, our perspective is the landscape. We have a unique relationship with that landscape. We also have a great law. So that great law, the Guyana-Goa, is what we also have that teaches us of the, how to acknowledge. It shows us how to conduct principles of how to care and share, peace, power, righteousness. But again, that center of that also goes back to the natural environment, the respect for it, the respect for one another, respect for the universe. So again, it's all to me, much of what I grew up. So, a lot of this stuff was pretty foreign to me when I ended up coming off to the reserve and deciding, and, I believe it was 2018. No, it wasn't 2018. It was 2008 that I started to be able to go get Western knowledge. Sorry, I'm traditional knowledge. So again, like I said, I've been jumped on this, this adventure, I'll call it, because it's really been an adventure from Joanne's vision, her journey, her dream. So today I want to emphasize that what is beneath our feet is the land. So from the very beginning, the original times for Indigenous people was the forces of ecology. That's what taught us. It taught us kinship. It taught us how to, our relationship with that system, our natural environment, So it wasn't about settings, and it wasn't about built heritages, as Gary had one of the slides. It was, you know, what is beneath us? And hopefully soon we can be brought up to parity of be able to say with different, you know, regions, municipalities are doing real good, and they're starting to say, you know what, Tanya, you're right. I do understand that we do need to acknowledge this and put, you know, built heritage and archaeological sites at parity, right? Which, you know, before we were not there. So a lot of what we know, obviously, as Gary said, was passed down, as for myself as well, through oral history, right? So a lot when I grew up with, when I talk about the ceremonies and stuff, like we had different ways of conducting our life. You know, when I became pregnant, you know, I wasn't supposed to stand in doorways, I wasn't supposed to look in mirrors. So we have all of these different principles and the way that we conduct ourselves. Our language, as I spoke earlier, you know, Ongwe Hoi means the people of the ways of the forever. So, you know, we have all of this built into our language. We all basically unite on all of these different aspects of it. I know that I learned through, you know, a really good book that Gary, you know, he made us read, which, you know, was probably the best book ever, but it was, I think her name is Maria Baptiste. Is that her name? Yep. And she talked about intellectual properties in there, and that is a really good book, because you know what? I never really realized with a lot of things I did, you know, ceremonial, things I taught through oral tradition, you know, just a connection that I have to my animals, that there's an intellectual property there that I'm passing on, right? That I didn't even realize, because it's, you know, a personal thing against myself and with that natural environment. And it was that respect as an intellectual property, right? Sustainability, you know, you know, we're dealing with that right now, because, you know, as we knew for sustainability, we're transient people, we could travel to different campsites when we knew that it was time. This area is depleting. I really don't think that, well, we know that today that we don't have that sustainability anymore. It's basically go in there, you know, do this excavation, archaeology's called in to basically go in there and just rip that page out, as Gary, you know, mentioned. That is really well said, because we do it all the time, right? That history book gets removed, all in the name of development. I support development. I'm there to support development. I'm not there to not, but, you know, I'm glad that our voice is there to ensure that the non-renewable archaeology is actually taken out of the ground in a respectful and a protective manner, right? So I've spent a lot of time in this area. I was on Fisher Hammond, you know, boots on the ground. I'm there at, you know, Huron South. I hear it in this whole area all the time, us and our monitors still today, you know, Gale Place, we're all still, you know, out on the ground, you know, checking out those post molds, as Gary mentioned. There was one, and we just finished it up in 2021, Gale Place, where we had 11 longhouses there, right? And, you know, that was just in 2021, so we're still finding a lot, right? Our monitors were on site. They you know, were there for that Indigenous perspective to, you know, walk through the whole process with the archaeology. So that, you know, has merged in really well. I'm really thankful that, you know, our Indigenous voice is there. And we learned a lot too, because again, our heritage was taken away from us. So, you know, we learned just as much as, you know, the archaeology company, right? Or the archaeology universities, you know, we learned just as much, because a lot of this was taken away. And I always like to say to, you know, we envision, you know, us people standing at the river, as Gary showed many slides of the river. You know, we're standing there, we're with our aunties, our grandmas, our mom, and we're just maintaining cap. And then within that camp, you know, a group of, you know, when I grew up, they called them pale faces. And, you know, I don't know why, but that's what I learned. So just a group of non-Indigenous people coming over, you know, the hill, and all of a sudden running into your encampment and taking your people and forever changing your ways. And that's kind of what happened to us. And, you know, from those times on, you know, we don't even know what is really out there, and we've been kind of sort of left through residential schools not to know about, you know, our history. You know, I meet with a lot of the survivors. They talk about, you know, taxing their tongue for speaking their language, talking about anything with heritage. So there was a really terrible era that took place, and our people today, you know, in our community still have that post-traumatic stress passed down through, I would say, blood memory, because nobody sat this person down and had that trauma, but for some reason it trickles down, and there's still a lot of trauma in our community. And that's just one piece of my job. So I do sit, you know, with elders, but I grew up with that because my dad was like, if you be bad, Tanya, I'm going to take you to the mush hole, which, you know, I never, which I never made it. My parents never made it. Like my dad had a lot of friends who went to residential school, but my dad's family did not go to residential school, but they, you know, their friends did, so they would come home and they would talk about it, right? So, yeah, you know, residential schools still play a big part, and, you know, as today, you know, I mentioned to different people, like, a lot of Indigenous perspectives and Indigenous people's knowledge and voice hasn't really been, you know, heard until the Every Child Matters. You know, like now I have people walk up to me all the time and they're like, Tanya, are you serious? There was residential schools? This really did happen? And I would just say, yeah, you know, and then I explain to them, and, you know, it's, you know, now history is starting to really, you know, in a positive way, come out for Indigenous people and that voice from a tragic event. People are having awareness. They want increased knowledge, which is great. So, you know, to something really horrible, it's been really productive in trying to get that voice out there. So again, our natural environment, as you have heard, it's a connection. Indigenous people seek to sustain our spiritual links to the land. So that's part of our spiritual links there. A lot of times on site, growing up with burial, my dad and the ceremonies. Again, I don't know how, you know, I believe that the universe put me in this position for a certain reason, because again, I didn't know that was going to happen to Joanne. I planned on writing my LSAT to go to law school in June 2020, so then all of a sudden I'm in this full-time role, which, you know, for me, I feel like it put me there for a reason. An ancestor has set me through this path and guided me, because there's not a whole lot of people who grew up with the burial and how to respect the burial. So again, as you know, we go out on these sites, and with the record-breaking development going on right now, we have astronomical amount of burial that's being exposed. So myself, I can go out there and I can, you know, talk to the consulting archaeology companies, I can talk to our monitors, and I could tell them, you know, this is how we want to respect our ancestors, the dead, you know, which, you know, we're spiritual people, so we really believe that you don't touch dead, you don't go that route. So, you know, I always emphasize that for, you know, whoever's on site. You know, our ancestor was put there for a reason. They had a ceremony conducted, and there's different features we find, because sometimes you'll find animal above burial. Sometimes you'll find different aspects of understanding that that person was in their final destination, and there was a journey that was proposed through ceremony for them from those different remnants that are found, right? So I go out on site and then I tell them, you know what, this is our ancestor, I'm sorry, we're going to avoid and protect this area. A lot of times developers ain't too happy, but you know, we do compromise and we get through it, right? So I personally do not want anybody to exhume our ancestor. We had a situation where that had happened, like since I've been in this role, but you know, we don't want our ancestors to be studied anymore. They're not science research projects, they are our ancestor. That is a person, that's an individual, so we leave them in situ and don't disturb the dead. So today, commercially, heritage that gives us the Indigenous people's identity is basically assaulted. It would be gathered up, stripped away of its honor and its meaning for Indigenous people. Then it's converted as a product, researched on, and advanced from. this is why people like myself, we advocate for more involvement, because, you know, we don't want to see that anymore. You know, it's all about process, and, you know, we don't want to see that process anymore. We want to see our ancestors, and a lot of times, as Gary mentioned, they go in there and, you know, they mitigate these different areas, and, you know, we just say, you know, a lot of times we don't want it. We just want them left in the ground. They just leave the heritage there. We want to avoid and protect that area. A lot of times, you know, we don't always have a whole lot of support for that. But again, we're starting to get control over our resources, which is really helpful, because again, like as an Indigenous person, you know, not having that voice has been really difficult. I always got to keep myself on track here. I do have PowerPoints, but again, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I always want to speak from myself in an Indigenous perspective way, because that's how I was taught. I was taught through stories and not from visual art and stuff like that, but I wanted to keep a couple of Gary slides up there. They were good, and they would have kept me on my journey with you guys tonight. So again, we're just trying to reclaim our perspectives, revitalization, and, you know, working together through resilience. We're all trying to, you know, we're trying to bounce back. We're trying to, you know, get that voice out there, and it's slow moving. So I guess I'll talk about, you know, archaeology is an investigative process that studies human history, prehistory through excavation of archaeology sites. The evidence of these sites is considered an analysis of artifacts and other physical remains left behind by our ancestors. Archaeology for me is a scientific, destructive process, as Gary mentioned, through cultural materials in which artifacts are removed from areas of significance. When cultural materials are recovered from archaeological site, the next stage for us when we're out in the field through our archaeological program is the ministry oversees it. So the Ministry of Culture and Citizenship, they call themselves now. So the consulting archaeologists will reach out to the ministry for guidance. We are starting to get a really strong voice in there. We still have a little bit of ways to go, but, you know, I just wanted to make sure that I outlined to you guys where we sit now in 2023 with you know, our heritage. So the ministry basically gives guidance. The archaeological firms are the ones who have jurisdiction over our heritage and site mitigation. So they record and store our artifacts at sustainable archaeology facilities, or in private storage, or at consulting archaeology companies. So the artifacts, again, are possession of the province under the licensee. So we're working on trying to get some of our Indigenous people licensed as well, because again, as Gary mentioned earlier, like I sit in the Lands and Resource Office, and there's women in there who've been studying land claims for 30 years, 35 years, and you know what? They're the PhD doctor to me because of all those years of knowledge and everything that they've been transcribing all these years. So we're trying to work on getting some of our monitors who've been out into the field for the last 10 years working with consulting archaeologists, and we're trying to convince that Ministry of Culture and Citizenship that, hey, just because they don't have that Western knowledge, why can't they have a license? So we're kind of working through that one right now. So again, artifacts become under the licensee and under the province. So the ministry, for, you know, some of the guidance and some of the advocacy that I'm doing is that I'm advocating to the ministry to say, like, we need a more direct, inclusive approach and not in a subjective approach anymore. And that for our program is where it sits at today for 2023 with archaeology for Indigenous communities. You know, it's still a subjective process, which it shouldn't be like that. So again, we're not, you know, we've grabbed, you know, a hold pretty good, but we're still got a long way to go. So I will say, you know, Six Nations has evolved to now that we are sitting at the table of the coroner's office, so we're working really close with them because the coroner's office is where Indigenous remains, and the police are first there called on site because that's the practice of Ontario. You know, as soon as Indigenous remains are found, it's like, okay, call the police, call the coroner. So as soon as that call comes through, I have a direct relationship now with the coroner's office in Toronto, and they call me right up and they're like, Tanya, please come out to site. We found Indigenous remains. We want to know how you would like these protected and respected, which is a new process that, you know, it's not guidance from Ontario because we still don't have that guidance from the Ministry of Culture and Citizenship, who are, you know, the governing body over our heritage. We're still lagging real far with them. We don't have any access to archaeological sites according to the ministry till stage 3. So which is, you know, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. So 3 and 4, which is right at the end. So stage 1 and 2 is basically, stage 1 is the desktop search to say this area has potential. And then if there is potential and if there is a trigger, then it goes to stage 2. And then again, they start digging test pits. They do pedestrian surveys to see what the potential is. And, you know, so if a consulting archaeologist decides to say, you know what, there's no archaeology here, it doesn't even get to a 3 or a 4. So that's very problematic for us Indigenous communities. With that being said, I advocate really hard, and we're starting to get into municipalities and regions. We're starting to get in a lot of consulting archaeology companies' ears, and they're saying, you know what, you're right, or we're going to include you guys in the planning stages now, which is really important because, you know, again, say an ancestors are unearthed or an archaeological site is impacted, generally we're called in when there's issues, and then it's like really hard to fix. So if we're in the planning stages, we can all move forward with a, you know, a meaningful, productive manner. So we have 30 representatives currently now for Six Nations, our team. So I have 30 representatives under me where, you know, I provide guidance for different archaeological sites. Universities are now reaching out to free and prior consent before they conduct a lot of the archaeology studies on our pottery or on, you know, any of the remnants of our artifacts. So they're saying, you know what, we need to be inclusive to Indigenous communities. So these are all advancements for, you know, Six Nations. There's always going to be disagreements on site because, again, you know, I had this for the last 2 years now where a consulting archaeology company will say, you know what, that's not of significance. And, you know, how can they tell an Indigenous person what is important? So that's kind of some of the disagreements we have on site. But we make, you know, our way through it through mutual respect because, you know, when I'm teaching the monitors who are starting out with our group, I always say, you know, we're out there, we're built on mutual respect. We respect the land, we respect each other, we follow those principles as we mentioned earlier with, you know, the Guyana Goa or the Thanksgiving address where we teach and treat everybody the same, equally and honestly. So I could probably go into some of the other work we're doing, but I'm not going to do that today. But I just want to make sure that I emphasize some of the important, very important, you know, inclusion that's been moving forward for Indigenous communities. And as you can see through Gary's presentation, that a lot of this is, you know, written out of an Indigenous person's life, right? And, you know, if it wasn't for a lot of people advocating and you guys here today to, you know, to honor some of the heritage of Indigenous people, you know, we probably would continually not have that acknowledgement. So I'm appreciative of all of that from you guys today, inviting me to speak today and, you know, just to talk about, you know, that relationship to the natural environment, because that's the center focus of Indigenous people. Like when I drove out here, as I mentioned earlier, you know, I'm driving through these back roads and I'm looking at the landscape and I'm like, wow, I just feel like there's a connection, you know, back to that intellectual properties of that knowledge and that feeling where there's a connection to the land. And I'm like look at the topography, look at the landscape, you know, where there's just something there that I can feel, right? So it's amazing how we have that intuition. So I want to thank you guys today. I won't bore you with all my talk today, but yeah, I'm thankful for you guys and for listening to me today. And if you ever need to talk to me, I'm in the Lands and Resource Office, and I can assist with anybody's questions. And another thing that I got thinking about when I was driving out here down those back roads as well is how a lot of these roads were built on old Indian trails. And I got that feeling driving through, and I'm just like, my ancestors went through that area at some point, and I know they did because a lot of our land and archaeological evidence will provide that when we're digging on the side of roads where all of a sudden artifacts will be found. Fisher Hallman, for instance, I'm kind of rambling on now, but I was on that since 2020, and we stripped back 7 layers of asphalt and stone, and then there was a whole village there, right? There was a whole story, a whole social structure that was underneath that road. So you guys are really lucky. When I drive out here, I look at the beautiful, dirt, the soils. I look at, the trees, and, you guys have a really beautiful area. And I hate to see it, get, taken away by, and I won't get, into that kind of stuff because, I shouldn't get into that kind of stuff. But, I just want to thank you guys. So nyawa.
There we are. Thanks so much, Tanya and Gary, for coming tonight. We're glad to have you here. It was a wonderful talk and great to hear all about research and perspectives, so I really enjoyed it. I do have a small token of appreciation for the township, from the township for you. So thanks very much again. Thank you both. And if anyone has had a chance yet, or there's displays downstairs, so feel free to take a look. And there were cookies and coffee. I don't know if it's still there, but there may be. So thanks very much.